So tonight we are going to be doing beginning vegetable garden. I'm Adam Watson. I'm one of our ag agents here in Washington County, and I focus on horticulture. And so this is meant to be a rather introductory class. So if you've got a lot of experience in gardening, you'll probably find some of this a little bit elementary. But if you're new to gardening, I hope this is very welcoming. And so that's kind of the whole point tonight is we want to make this as start from zero as possible. So I hope it's not too basic for some, but certainly I think there's value in it. So I'll mention if there's any sort of trade names, suppliers, or anything like that that I mention as we go through tonight. Just understand it is not an endorsement by myself nor the university. We don't do that. And so it's just mentioned for clarity and for understanding. I also like to start, especially when I'm thinking of speaking to beginning gardeners, this thought that gardening is a skill, not a gift. So sometimes I run into people that are really intimidated to try gardening. They may have friends or family that are very talented, gifted gardeners, and they act like, well, I don't have the gift, I can't do it. I don't believe in that. I think everybody can be an adequate gardener. There may be some more gifted than others, but one of the reasons Grandma was so good at it, she's been doing it for several decades. It's amazing how good a bad person can become when you keep trying. And so don't let gardening intimidate you. I want you to tackle it. I want you to try it if it's something you want to do. The other thought I really want to stress with beginning gardeners, a small garden well tended is better than a large garden that's not quite so well tended. So even just starting with a few plants, that's going to give you some knowledge, some experience. And it's much easier to tend to a small garden than a large one. And so I'd rather have you have 2 tomato plants that do great than 15 that do eh. Because at the end of the day, you'll actually get more production out of that couple of plants that is well cared for. What's neat about vegetable gardens in our area is we actually kind of have a 3 faceted season that we can garden in. So we have the early season, which really kind of starts at the end of winter, probably mid-February-ish for the most hardiest vegetables, kind of goes until May. The warm season then runs from May until July. And in this, I'm talking more about planting season, not just the growing or the harvesting portion. And then we also have a fall season. So depending on your life, your schedule, one of these may be more attractive than the others. Some just may not be feasible. And so that's great because you have the ability basically from late winter all the way to late fall actually be producing things in the vegetable garden. I thought what I'd do tonight is focus basically on the basics of what do those vegetable plants need. And so we're going to take it very basically. These are kind of the topics we're going to hit on, and then there'll be some thoughts added along the way and some specific things towards the end as well. But again, I don't think anybody that's joining us is going to be surprised that sun, water, and nutrients from the soil are needed by plants. But also we need to think about seasonality or the time to reach maturity. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So whenever you see things talking about vegetable gardening, almost universally, it says full sun. What in the world does that mean? Generally, it means at least 6 to 8 hours of sun. So depending where your garden might be, that could be morning sun, that could be midday sun, that could be evening sun. That is not full sun exposure where you're out in the middle of a field or something. So there's a lot of places where we can have a garden that isn't necessarily sunny all day long. Some things to understand is like if we do have southern and western exposure for a site, generally that's going to be warmer than if it was north or eastern exposure. Doesn't mean we can't use it. We just have to know that. So in the summer, some of those areas might be very hot. When we think about siting the garden in regards to sun, we want to think about trees and buildings because both of those are throwing shadows. And so we do want to think about putting them on the south or the west side of buildings if possible. If we put them on the north side of buildings, they're going to be relatively well shaded. Again, that doesn't mean it can't have a garden there, especially if there's good eastern exposure. But just think about where shadows are falling, where you place your garden, and keep the rule of thumb, more sun is better. Soils. So well drained. Again, that's one of those terms you always find in gardening literature. And basically, the way I kind of simplify it is it's not waterlogged after raining. So after you've had a decent amount of rain, that's really wet things. If you go walking across the area and it's squishy, water is coming up, that's waterlogged. That means it's not draining well. So if grass doesn't grow there well, if you have certain weeds that prefer wet conditions, if there's a lot of willow trees growing around it, all those would be indications that probably this is not a well-drained area. And so that would not be a good place because like most plants, our vegetables have to have oxygen in the root zone. And basically within soil, water and air occupy the same spaces. And so we want a balance, and a well-drained soil will give us that balance. A waterlogged soil that doesn't drain water away well will not, will have too little oxygen for those roots. And so that's why we look for well-drained areas. Ideally, it would be a spot that we already know to be fertile. And so what I mean by that, if you have an area in the yard that just absolutely will not grow grass or weeds, it's probably not the greatest place to plant the garden. On the other hand, if it's a grassy spot, it looks okay, you're probably going to be okay to plant a garden there. And so, we'll talk about soil testing in a minute, but one of the first most basic things is, do we have plants already growing there and are they successful? If they are, it's probably a good spot that might be workable for us. We do want to avoid septic leach fields. If everything works perfectly within the leach field, there's probably very little concern, but things don't always work right with leach fields. So we just avoid them. The other thing is if we do have any sort of equipment or something, we don't necessarily want to be driving those over leach fields anyway. So we just avoid it and sidestep the issue. We would love to have perfectly flat garden areas. The reality in our region, that's not always available to us. So slopes are okay, but there are things we can do. So rather than running rows up and down the hill, we can run them across the hill. One of the things, if you've ever gardened on hills, the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill, the soil is not the same, in part because of erosion. So we have deeper soils typically towards the bottoms and thinner soils as we get higher up. So by going horizontally across a hill, basically the row is more uniform. The other thing by going horizontally, we're basically creating speed bumps for water. And so by doing that, we're reducing the risk of erosion on that hill. So again, slopes are okay. We may take a few extra steps to make sure we don't have erosion issues, but we can make a sloping area work well for us. It's not a deal breaker at all. Tillage is not absolutely required to have a garden. And so this is one that I think in recent years, there's more and more information available. And I'll admit a lot of it is anecdotal, not necessarily research-based, but we know that tillage has a lot of negatives associated with it. Until soils will create what's called structure. Part of it is due to the inherent qualities of the soil particles. Some of it is due to soil biology, literally bacteria gluing things together, fungi, actually kind of stringing stuff together. And the structure that forms actually allows water and air to infiltrate the soil better. And that's good for our plants, it's good for the soil. And whenever we go through and chop everything up very finely, we destroy any natural structure that is there. So that's a negative thing. The other thing that happens whenever we till, we're chopping up organic matter and actually adding oxygen into the soil. And I know you're like, hey, he just said oxygen's needed for roots. It is. But in this case, by adding oxygen and increasing the surface area of organic matter, which basically is stuff that was formerly living, you speed its decomposition. On the one hand, that releases nutrients for plants. On the other hand, organic matter does a great job of holding on to nutrients, holding on to water, and improving our soils. So if we're burning through it, we're losing good characteristics of our soil just to get a kind of quick bump of nutrients. We've got other ways to put nutrients into the soil. So we'd like to minimize the tillage. It is a tool that we might use. It is it's not something that's just universally horrible. For one, if you have an area that's never been gardened before, it's hard to beat the speed at which you can start gardening in it when you're utilizing tillage. So, if you're tilling under grass and things like that, 10, 14 days after you till it under, you're perfectly fine to go start gardening in that area. There's almost no other method that gives us that speed into gardening. There's a lot of things we can do, like utilizing various kinds of tarping, or the more technical term, occultation. Just like occult, it's hidden. So if we're using cardboard or things like that to smother weeds or heavy mulches, those take some time to be effective. And so because of that, they can be used, but they don't have that speed. So definitely tillage can be a tool we use. The other thing that tillage is good for is killing cover crops. So if you've got an overwintering cover crop, and especially if you're adverse to utilizing herbicides, tillage can be a primary tool for you to kill it. It also helps incorporate it into the soil where maybe we don't want a heavy mulch. So it's not universally terrible, but tillage is a tool that I think of as a double-edged sword. It has some positives to it. There's some uses for it, but we don't want it to be the principal thing that we do in our garden, because over time, it does tend to degrade soils. And so just think about when and how you use it. Another statement I think I need to make: clay soils are not bad. So, very often when I'm talking to folks, when they're coming in here, they're like, oh, I got clay soil. That's okay. So clay soils, soil particles, we have sand, silt, and clay. Everybody's soil is made up of any one of the three or any combination of the three. Clay soils are great because they actually store water well. They store nutrients well. They hold on to it. The challenge, though, sometimes is their management, because when they're wet, they're very wet. When they're dry, they're very dry. They can be prone to crusting. And so that's where, we get into issues. The other thing is sometimes people say, I have clay soil, when really what they're saying is I have no topsoil. Because in a lot of housing developments, especially, topsoil gets scraped off and sowed off. And you're left with subsoil, which is not topsoil. And so that can make it challenging to grow much of anything. And so you're you're starting probably from worse than zero because you've actually lost topsoil. So just understand that there's ways to even come back from that and improve your soils. But just don't universally think clay soils are bad, because one, every time someone tells me that, I say, what do you think all the big trees around here are growing in? It's the native clay soils. So it's not universally a bad thing. It's just we have to understand maybe a little bit of its character and how we might limit doing some things when they're wet. And we might look at doing things like mulching to reduce them from drying out so quickly, or preventing crusting. And so, again, some of it comes down to experience. And so just don't write off a soil because it's clay-based and think, well, I have to bring in something from outside. That's not necessarily true. The one thing I must say about clays: never add sand to clay soils. You get bricks. So what happens if you compare the particle size of soil? Again, I said basically you have sand, you have silt, you have clay. Sand is the largest, and clay is the smallest. So think about, you have a 5-gallon bucket full of baseballs. That's our bucket of sand. Then take a bunch of little BBs, little steel BBs. Pour those into the bucket and completely fill it up. Do you think it's going to be heavier now that we've added the BBs than before we added it? Of course. And what happens when we add sand to clay soils, the clay fits in between the sand particles. So the technical term for what we did is we increased the bulk density of the soil. The literal term is we've packed more stuff into a smaller space. And so what we've done is we've limited the room for air, we limited the room for water. And we've literally created bricks, essentially. So never add sand to a clay soil thinking I'm going to make it more free draining. You won't. You're actually just going to create a very dense soil that's not much good for anything. So just be careful with that. What you can add: organic matter. Adding organic matter to any soil is going to improve it. So if you're wanting to do something to improve how clay is behaving, adding organic matter, and again, organic matter is just stuff that was living or derived from stuff that was living. So it's everything from yard debris to leaves to manures, anything like that, any sort of plant biomass. A soil test is a good tool. I don't think it's always critical for success, but certainly if we're having a garden not behave the way we would want, we're not having the outcomes we want, soil testing can rule some things out and make sure we've got some things right. So again, if we have an area that's growing a lawn well, we're probably okay. If you don't want to immediately rush out and get a soil test, you'll probably be fine. Lawns and vegetable gardens need similar soil characteristics. So if one's doing well, I would expect the other to. But it is something that you can do through our office. It's $25 per sample. What it comes back with are things like the soil pH. pH relates to how available nutrients are to plants. So we can have nutrients in our soil, but if our pH is too acidic or too basic, they're not necessarily available to plants. So, and a lot of gardeners understand there are some plants that like low pHs or acidic conditions, like blueberries. So if you're looking at planting blueberries, I would say a soil test is a must, because we have to know what your soil pH is at currently to know how much sulfur to add to drop it low enough that the blueberries are going to be their happiest. And so because of that, in those cases, I'd say we must do a soil test. Home garden, we can probably skip it for a couple of years. I don't think in most home garden scenarios, doing it more frequently than every 3 to 5 years is necessary, unless you're starting to see something happen and it's not explainable. So we want to see maybe what's happening with our soils. So it looks at soil pH, it looks at nutrient levels. It doesn't test for nitrogen specifically, because nitrogen is hard to test for. You can get a number. It doesn't necessarily tell you a lot. It moves a lot in the environment. It moves from one organism to another, and it's very difficult to actually get anything meaningful from nitrogen numbers. So we actually don't test for it for that reason. Speaking of soils, when we're talking about raised beds and containers, and you can have great vegetable gardens in raised beds or containers. And very often, it seems like, especially online, raised beds are just presented as the be all end all of vegetable gardens. They're just superior in every form and facet. I don't find that necessarily true. And one of the big problems I have with them is, what on earth do we fill it with? And so you probably, some of the best things to do is actually use the soil on site if you have decent soils available. You can look at purchased topsoil that's stolen from somebody else's housing development. But topsoil is, to me, only something that occurs where it developed, in situ. It doesn't move. And part of it is because some of the characteristics of topsoil are aggregation and organic matter and things like that. And whenever it gets dug up and screened and transported, a lot of that disappears. So it's a good mineral soil, but I wouldn't necessarily call it topsoil. So you can purchase topsoil for the Lincoln Park vegetable garden. They went that route with filling the beds with a purchased topsoil. Not the most beautiful soil you ever see, but it worked. It grows vegetables fine. So that is one option. On-site soils are an option. So keep that in mind. And the other thing, and what's actually represented in this picture, this was a school garden that we were doing. And we did a few of these around the county. And basically, we just filled up the beds with potting media or potting soil, which isn't soil at all because there's no soil in it. It's actually a media, largely composed of peat, composted bark, perlite or vermiculite. And vegetables did great in it and have been doing great for a few years. We have to sometimes top them up because one of the things that happens as some of those materials start to decompose and break down, they subside, they reduce in volume. So you may have to top off a bed, especially if it's composed of largely organic materials. You will find over the years your soil is shrinking. That's because it's breaking down. If we're talking about true containers, not like raised beds, I would say probably just go with a potting media. I don't think smaller containers I think it's more of a hassle to use on-site soils or even topsoils. I think on a small scale, soil does not behave well in a container. And if I'm doing a raised bed, I want it to be at least 10 inches deep. I really like for them to have a bottom that allows the plants to ultimately root down into the native soils beneath it. That's not always possible because you may be having a raised bed or a container because it doesn't have soil. You may be gardening on a patio or something like that. In those cases, I might take that minimum 10%, 10-inch depth and actually up it a little bit to maybe 15 or 18 if I can't access the soil underneath, just to make sure we have more soil volume, because roots will explore the soil that's available to them. If you've ever grown houseplants, one way you can kind of keep some houseplants a little under control on size is keeping them in a small pot. And so when they have a larger rooting volume, you're able to get a more true to size form of a plant. The other thing is more soil volume allows you to have more water and nutrients available to the plant, especially watering. Hanging baskets look lovely, but if you're the one that has to water that big giant petunia basket every single day, the beauty starts to wane after a little bit, in my opinion. So a lot of people who have had those are know exactly what I'm talking about. And so a larger container allows you to have less frequent waterings, and that's a good thing for us. When we're watering, we would like to avoid wetting the foliage of the plant, or we want to water earlier in the day. The reason being is it will dry off throughout the day. So leaf wetness directly contributes to any number of different diseases. It's the conditions that the fungal spores need to germinate, essentially. Bacteria loves to move in water, so the longer water is on a plant, the more likely we are to have bacteria movement. And so if we can avoid wetting the foliage, this is why drip irrigation, one of the reasons it works really well, because we're not wetting the upper parts of the plant. We're just wetting the soil. It's more efficient as well. What I want to encourage you to do when you water is to water deeply and infrequently. So whenever we have a sufficient volume of soil available to plants, it shouldn't be where we have to water every single day. In fact, it's detrimental. What we want to do is water in a way that we're putting enough water into that soil profile that there's a reserve there. And so the plant will grow roots out, find that water, and use it. So that means we're not watering every single day. Another thing to understand about raised beds or containers, they do dry out faster than an in-ground planting. So if you have both, or even if you only have containers and raised beds, they will need more care with water than if you were growing in ground. And so just be aware that they're more exposed to wind, they're more exposed to sun, and so that does dry them out faster. How do you know when you need to water? The absolutely best moisture meter that I can advise you to use are your fingers. Your hand is going to tell you. So if you're filling in the soil, it's not feeling moist in the first few inches, you probably need to water. The other thing I want you to try this season, if you've never done it before, if you are watering things, once you're done, start digging down in the soil and see how deeply the soil is wet. I have seen a lot of gardeners that don't water deeply. They water well across the surface, but if you start scraping back the soil and saying, okay, how far down did the water actually go? It doesn't go very far at all. And if we only water the first inch or two of soil, that's where most of our roots are going to stay. And the bad thing is they'll start exhausting the nutrients that are available in that little bit of area. So by encouraging deeper water, the roots will grow deeper, seeking out water, and that encourages them to find more nutrients available to them. So always think about, and the other thing you can do is you can take any straight walled container and just see how long does it take for you to apply like an inch of water for a container that size. That can give you an idea of how, okay, if this is a 2 foot by 2 foot, that's 4 square feet, how many of those do I have over the surface of this bed? And then you kind of do some math. So just think about how deeply are you actually wetting the soils and actually check it physically. I don't think I'm not aware of any inexpensive moisture meters or anything like that that are effective. I know there are some on the market. I don't necessarily believe they are effective. So fingers work great. One thing to understand if we're growing in containers and we're utilizing potting media, particularly if it has a large percentage of peat moss. Peat moss becomes hydrophobic when it's dry. It will actually float on top of water. If you've ever purchased potting soil and it's been very dry, if you try to add water to it, you generally have to let it sit a while. What a lot of commercial nurseries will do the day before they're getting ready to pot things up, they'll actually start wetting the media then to give it time to soak in and absorb it. And so what this means functionally is we can have a pot that we're watering and very quickly water's flowing out the bottom. We're like, oh, we're done. But if you pick the pot up, it's still going to be extremely light. It's because that peat moss dried out to a point that it didn't soak up any water. It just ran straight through. So in a lot of cases, having a saucer, some kind of container that the plant is sitting in when you're watering it can help because it basically has a reservoir there and it'll allow the plant or the peat moss rather, to suck up that water. We want to do that for a limited amount of time though. If we leave a pot setting in water constantly, it is waterlogging the bottom layers of that pot. And that is excluding oxygen from that bottom layer. And that means no roots are going to grow there. If we already have roots growing there, we can kill them. We can open them up to diseases. So utilizing a saucer to help plants hydrate the media or help us hydrate those potted plants media better is a good plan, but we don't want to keep saucers sitting in plants sitting in water or a saucer all the time. So just be aware of that. I have some plants I actually water through the saucer. So basically I fill up the little saucer they're sitting in, and that's how much water they get. And if you come back 20 minutes later, there's no water in the saucer. It's been sucked up. So watering from the bottom can actually be an effective way to water containers. Watering the amounts you need is always hard to talk about because it depends on the plant, it depends on the stage of growth, it depends on the weather. The rule of thumb, it's a very basic rule of thumb, is generally a garden needs about 1 inch of water per week. Functionally, they're going to need less water when they're smaller. Later, they're going to need more water because they're larger. So it's a good rule of thumb, but I wouldn't necessarily hang my hat on it. I wouldn't just, calculate this is about 1 inch of water if I run the water this many minutes. If you have a sprinkler system or something, I would still pay attention to what the weather is doing. I would still be checking the soil because I want us to be watering before we see plants wilting. A plant wilting should be like, red lights flashing. Uh-oh, we really messed up. Because that's saying that plant is extremely stressed and very lacking in water. And so we don't want that to happen. So we want to be catching it sooner than that. And certainly with experience, you kind of get into a rhythm of how frequently you need to water things, but then take into consideration as that plant's getting larger, as it's setting more fruit, more water is going to be required. And so it's not a static amount of water that we're always applying. And certainly there are some seasons or some portion of the season where we may not water much. Last year was a perfect example of when we watered a lot. And in fact, we were wet early, then we were hot, then we were wet, then we were hot. And so it was up and down, up and down. And so having irrigation or water available to those plants was very important to get a good yield. Last year, in fact, I installed an irrigation system in the Lincoln Park vegetable garden, and it worked very well. We were very pleased with how the plants produced, despite the multiple weeks of 90-degree weather we saw. So water really helps plants deal with higher temperatures. So keep that in mind. What about the nutrient side that plants need? So in short, I would say that vegetables are benefited by supplemental nutrients. And so whenever we talk about fertilizers, we're talking about products that we're adding to add nutrients to the soil or make them more available to plants. They come in many forms. Then we also have soil amendments. And soil amendments, I kind of classify and I kind of distinguish the two because fertilizers, like, okay, the reason I'm adding a fertilizer is it's nutrients. A soil amendment, I may be adding because of some other beneficial effect, and it may or may not have nutrients associated with it. And the reason I make that distinction is a lot of our soil amendments may have nutrients, but they're not rapidly available. So to me, the classic example would be compost. I would not call compost a fertilizer, and I would not treat it as such. So compost is great. It adds organic matter. It has some nutrients available, but a very small percentage. If you actually look at a compost materials label, it will have like 3 numbers. Those 3 numbers in the fertility world are percent nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It would not be uncommon to see a compost labeled 0.1, 0.1, 0.1, which means for every 10 pounds of compost, you're applying, let me do math in my head, which is always terrible to do in front of people, but you're basically applying 1.6 ounces of nitrogen for 10 pounds of compost. And so that's not much. It's not a lot. And so what we want to think about then is looking at how we use compost beneficially. And to me, we're adding it because it's organic matter for our soil. It does a great job of holding nutrients, holding water, and it slowly makes those nutrients available, in part because it has to be broken down by soil biology. And so that's kind of why I distinguish amendments different from fertilizers. Fertilizers basically are very rapidly available in nutrients, if not instantaneous. Soil amendments take time. And so either one can and probably both should be used as part of a garden. For instance, when soils are very cold, the biology is less active. And so that means it's harder for nutrients to become available. So very early in the season, we may focus more on fertilizers. And then as we get warmer soil temperatures, things like slower release amendments like compost might actually be just as good for us. And so we can spend all night on fertilizers and soil amendments. In fact, I've got a class coming up May 29th about improving gardening soils. And part of it, we're going to talk about this more at length. So if you're interested in that, you may want to either catch it live or look at it once it gets up on YouTube. The other thing I think is worth talking about in nutrient section is lime. So lime is not a nutrient. Lime changes the pH of the soil. It makes it more alkaline or less acid, however you want to look at it. pH directly affects the availability of nutrients. So if we're out of the range, and most plants are 6 to 7. As long as we're in that range, there's very few nutrients that would be limited much at all. It's not a coincidence that most plants like growing in that range. It is, in fact, because that's where nutrients are most available. The problem is I often see people use lime periodically on some sort of schedule and not based on a soil test. I have seen soils that have been driven very alkaline in nature, and they have problems. And then we pull a soil test, lo and behold, they got a 7.2, 7.3 soil. And it's like, how on earth did this happen? This isn't our native soil. You get talking to them, oh, we lime every year. That's not how liming works. One, liming is slow to do its job. It takes 18 months, 2 years for it to have its full effect. And the only way anyone knows how much lime to use is to do a soil test. So one of the things that is calculated when they're testing your soil is called a soil buffer pH. What that number tells the lab is how resistant to change is the pH of your soil. And so when you get a lime recommendation back from a soil testing lab, it's not just based on the generic number of your soil pH was X, so it takes this much. They actually test your soil to figure out how quick or easy or how difficult it is to change that pH. And so you can have 2 soils with the same pH, but 2 different recommendations as to the amount of lime to use. So that's why I think that soil tests should always be used before using lime because we don't know. In fact, a few weeks ago, had a scenario where a homeowner um, had a front and backyard, and there was a lawn care company that was saying, "Yep, you need lime." So I asked him, I said, "How on earth could they tell that?" He's like, "I don't know." I said, "I don't think they could." So he pulled soil tests. I think it was the front yard didn't need it, the backyard did need it. I didn't know that. The only way we knew that was because we did a soil test. So I'm going to never recommend lime unless we have a soil test because even if we see certain weeds that would lead us to believe it's acidic and things like that, I still can't tell you how acidic, and I still can't tell you how resistant to change your soil pH is. That's where the lab work comes in. And so soil test and lime should go hand in hand. We do the soil test first. We know exactly what we're dealing with, and we can accurately apply lime. And so I think that's all I'll say about that. So what if we don't have a soil test? And this isn't uncommon. You want to get to gardening, you don't necessarily want to wait. Well, I'm not generally going to recommend you apply phosphorus or potassium unless we have a soil test telling us they're limited. The primary nutrient we add to growing plants essentially is nitrogen. And so we can use about 2 ounces of actual nitrogen per 100 square feet. And so you're probably asking, what on earth is actual nitrogen? Well, basically, the amount of fertilizer you use depends on the fertilizer you choose. So I mentioned earlier that like compost, they have the 3 numbers on the bag: nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium. If you have let's say a triple 10 product, where that first number is 10, that's telling you 10% of what you apply is actual nitrogen. So if I want 2 ounces of actual nitrogen, then I'm actually going to apply 20 ounces because only 10% of it's literally nitrogen because that's the content of it. If I'm applying a fertilizer that is 20% nitrogen, I'm going to only apply 10 ounces because that's how I get the 2. 20% of 10 is 2. And so it's all dependent on what fertilizer you use, even when you get a soil test recommendation back. It will have some examples of fertilizers you could use in it typically, but you can calculate the use of any fertilizer to get an accurate amount. It's all about the content of that. And so one of the things I see a lot with home gardens, we will see soil tests come back and the phosphorus and potassium are very high in the soil. When they're really out of whack, when they're totally off the scale, it can cause problems with micronutrients. But whenever we have high or very high categories listed on the soil test, what's that telling us is that there is no need to add any more of it because research says that when you have those conditions, the likelihood of either one of those being in any way limited is virtually zero. So what that means typically is what we see is people will use something like a triple 10 or a triple 20 or a triple 13 or 14, and they're actually over applying phosphorus and potassium. So the plant needs more nitrogen than it needs phosphorus and potassium. So in a perfect world, we would see a fertilizer that has more nitrogen content than potassium or phosphorus. Or we would use more than one product to get the balance we need. In the short term, you're paying more for nutrients you may not need, which isn't great. But in the long term, if we do it for a very long period of time, we are looking at over applying nutrients we don't need. Phosphorus, for instance, is actually what is a problem with fresh water and nutrient discharges more so than nitrogen. Nitrogen is a problem in the marine environment and oceans, but phosphorus is actually the problem in freshwater bodies, so algal blooms and things like that. So we do want to be careful sometimes how we're doing this and making sure we're not over applying phosphorus and potassium by trying to get enough nitrogen applied. So think about what materials you're using. You can use blended fertilizers or use some of different ones to get the exact ratios that you want. And again, that's where a soil test can help. Yes.
can explain that calculation again if you ever
Sure.
10, 10, 10.
So
how much nitrogen is
yeah.
that?
So whenever you're reading a soil test result, it will talk about, actual pounds of nitrogen you're applying. You look at the content of the material, the fertilizer you're applying, and you divide. So if it contains 10%, then you would divide that into the required pounds or ounces or whatever it is. And that will give you the number you need. I'm happy to, if you do a soil test with us, or even if you got it with some other lab, I'm happy to help you figure that out. That's not a problem. It's not hard to math once you get used to it. It's just kind of formulaic. I probably screwed up the math in front of people here because never do math in front of people. But yeah, it's not difficult. There's online calculators even that have it. It's not difficult to do. But yeah, it's like it's all about the content of that product, and that's why sometimes people will say, "I bought some fertilizer. How much do I need to use?" I'm like, "Well, what fertilizer did you buy?" Because literally you could overapply or underapply based on some number I just make up. Because without knowing the content, I can't tell you what you're doing. It'd be like taking medicine and not knowing the dosage size, sort of. So it is important to pay attention to that because we neither want to deprive the plant of nutrients nor put an excess out there. Both of them are problematic. And so we do want to kind of hit that sweet spot. So when we're talking about seasonality in the garden, there's basically two overarching principles. I don't think anybody is going to be surprised by this. A cool season crop typically doesn't do great in a warm season, and warm season crops typically don't do great in the cool season. Not earth shattering. I don't think anybody's surprised by that. How many people plant pansies in the middle of July? Nobody. They're not going to do well. They're probably not going to even survive. The other thing to think about when we're talking about weather, it's more than just air temperature. And that's sometimes what we notice, especially lately, some of the weather we've been having. We think, hey, I think we skipped spring and went straight to summer. This is actually, and it's not meant to give you particular numbers to zero in on. So if you think, how on earth am I going to read this? Don't worry, that's not the intent. What we have is actually a chart of online soil temperatures. If you search for soil temperatures, your Greencast Online will come up. Should be one of the top results. And you can actually look at soil temperatures where you're at. And so the blue line that you see there is this year. The green line is a 10-year average. The more navyish line is a 5-year average. So 5-year and 10-year very much track with each other, which we would expect. They're averages. But what you see is this year, we have been wildly above and wildly below on soil temperatures, on what we would expect for an average. And so, soil temperatures will jump, especially in late winter, quickly when we have those warm, sunny days like we've been experiencing. But I want you to also look is that's not really sustained. When we step out from that weather that's out of the ordinary, those soil temperatures drop back down, sometimes even below the average if we have colder than average conditions. So the point of this slide is just to have you think about whenever we're planting things out there, it's more than just the air temperature. Soil temperature will always lag air temperature. So it's going to feel like spring in the air before it feels like spring in the soil. There's always going to be that delay. And so depending what we're talking about, this is why I really harp on waiting until we're seasonally correct. So remember, I said we've got these 3 periods. We're not talking about any season extension like high tunnels or cold frames or anything like that, because certainly we can then talk about growing year round, and some of this gets really muddled when we do that. But for us, we've kind of got these 3 periods. The biggest date we probably need to know if we're starting gardening is our last frost of the winter season, which is typically by May 10th. So I want to spend a moment and explain this because I think this is important. If you start looking online, you will see very frequently people will say, well, if the last frost in our area averages April 19th, the average is absolutely useless to us because all an average says basically is half the time it's before that, half the time it's after that. So, and again, the numbers aren't important, but these are actually dates and when we had our last frost. So I pulled this from National Weather Organization. The last 5 years, 4 times our frost came after our average frost date. How's that the average? Well, if you look over 25 years, the average is April 19th. But in the last 5 years, 4 of those years, it was after that date. So if you say, well, I'm planting my tomatoes April 19th, and like on 2020, we have a May 10th freeze, your tomatoes aren't going to be very happy. They may survive, but they're not going to be happy. The other reality is if you're planting tomatoes in our area, in our soil conditions, particularly the temperature on April 19th, they're just going to sit there. The soil temperatures simply aren't going to be warm enough for them to grow much anyway. So you're not actually benefiting the plants. We like to go into the garden with a 6 to 8 year old tomato 6 to 8 years tomato. When we get older than that, it's hard to keep them from being root bound in a container. There's actually research that shows when you have things like tomato and pepper plants that get root bound, it influences their yield once you plant them out. So we don't want them to be stunted essentially while they're a young growing plant. So 6 to 8 weeks before. Peppers more 8 weeks, tomatoes more 6 weeks. So if we think about that and we're planting out, and I say conservatively plant about May 10th, because in the past 25 years, there have been 3 times that May 10th or later a frost happened or a freeze happened. One of those years, I think it was like in 2002, it was May 22nd. That was just way out there. So that's not normal. But, certainly early May, it's not unusual for us to have frost or freezes. So I conservatively say May 10th. What you will hear old timers say very often is you don't plant things like tomatoes out until Mother's Day. So again, that's about the second week of May, which again, 3 times out of the last 25 years, that may have still been problematic. So what I generally tell people to do, start considering around May 1st, can I plant these out? If we've had warm air temperatures consistently, you can take the soil temperature, you can look online for the data. It might be okay if we're above 60 degrees, go ahead and plant them out. If you look at that 10 and 14-day weather forecast, and it doesn't look like we're going to have a frost. It looks like we've got a cold air moving in, I would hang on to them. I wouldn't plant them out. And so again, it's more than just the air temperature. It's also the soil temperature. And the average frost is misleading because in this case, and in fact, lots of times you will find, when you find good resources relating to frost, they will talk about, a 90% frost date of X or Y. They relate it to majority of the time it will have already happened by this point, and occasionally not. So that's why I say about May 10th is what I think is most appropriate for our frost tender crops, our warm season crops. The first frost of the winter season around October 15th. It can be a little later, it can be a little earlier. I think it's less important to us as gardeners because typically the things that are still growing at that time of year are going to be frost tolerant anyway. Our warm season is pretty much done by then. It's just sitting there if it's alive still. So it's not as big of a deal. The problem is 2 or 3 weeks ago, you could find pepper plants for sale at box stores. I hope nobody planted those because even though we were having those beautiful days, that soil was way too cold. It is not going to end well for those pepper plants. Of course, there's always exceptions to seasonality. If you're not familiar with Swiss chard is a green that we can plant in later spring, so it actually can handle cool temperatures okay. It's frost tolerant, doesn't like hard freezes, but frost still shrug off. But the heat also doesn't bother it. So this is a leafy green that will grow all through summer. So, a lot of our leafy greens are cool season crops. So in summer, they're fewer and far between. Swiss chard is one that actually can take a beating, both cool and warm, and still keep going. So there are those oddballs out there. Another thing that sometimes I see beginning gardeners take a misstep on is when they plant what, or to what extent. And what I mean is lots of times people want to plant all their tomatoes or all their peppers or all their green beans all at once. And there's a problem if their goal was to have fresh eating out of the garden over the entire season. Because for most crops, they have a finite harvest period. And so what that means is they'll grow, they'll develop, and then they'll reach a point, they'll start the harvest, and then they'll fall off and they'll be done. There are indeterminate tomatoes that keep growing and growing. Generally, we have enough disease problems that it's not truly in perpetual harvest on them. They still reach a point typically where they start to fall off significantly. It can be due to fertility waning in the soil. It can be due to diseases, but there's very few things that truly keep yielding all season long with one single planting. And so lots of times when I talk to people about starting a vegetable garden, I ask, are you looking to do things like canning and freezing, or are you wanting mainly for fresh eating out of the garden? Because I'm going to plant those two gardens in different ways. So if I want to have a harvest over multiple weeks and months out of that garden, I'm going to spread the harvest out with multiple plantings. Or at least that's one way of doing it. Technical term is succession planting. And it's as complicated as you plant the crop when appropriate, wait 2 to 3 weeks, do it again. Wait 2 to 3 weeks, do it again. And what you have is different maturities. So as the earlier plantings are petering out with their yield, the newer plantings are coming on. And so it's allowing you to stem that fresh harvest. What we do if we want to do planting is we can actually concentrate it. Another way we can do spreading the harvest is doing one planting event, but planting different varieties of the same plant. So here we have some determinate tomatoes listed. Glacier's a 55-day to harvest from transplant. Valley Girl is 65, Mountain Merit is 75. So if we planted both Glacier and Mountain Merit, when Glacier was starting to peter out, Mountain Merit would be picking up. And so we can actually only plant one event, but use different varieties to spread it out by looking at the days to harvest or days to maturity. We can find that information on the back of seed packets. I encourage new gardeners really look at seed packets. They have a lot of great information. It's generally fairly easy to understand because they have limited real estate there, so they have to be concise with it. So it's generally a good chart. Seed catalogs will also give us a lot of information. It's more than just maturity. When we look at seed packets, we see things like planting depth, spacing in the garden, container size may be suggested, a lot of good information. So I encourage you, if you're not familiar with gardening, really take a look at your seeds that you're planting and their packaging, because there's a tremendous amount of information there. One thing I want to mention about leftover seed, especially for home gardeners, it's very often that packets contain more seed than you need for your garden. And so what that means, if we've got leftover seed, what I don't want you to do is throw it away. And what I don't want you to do is do anything that's going to lower the quality of it. What I want you to do is stick it in the freezer. Throw it in a Ziploc bag, put it in a jar, put it in a plastic container, whatever you would like, just put it in the freezer. Seeds are actually living. We don't really think about that, but they actually burn stored energy that is within that seed. When those seeds exhaust that energy in there or burn up so much, what's left is insufficient for germination, they won't germinate. And so by putting them in the freezer, we lower their rate of respiration to the point that they last and last and last. If you think about seed vaults, these entities that are preserving various species all around the world, generally they are kept at sub-zero temperatures, either in freezers or even in like nitrogen, liquid nitrogen, that's even colder. I don't suggest you put your seeds in liquid nitrogen, but certainly in the freezer really works. And so I know personally, my mom has used tomato seeds, for instance, that were 10 years old, and they germinate fine. There are a few seeds that this probably isn't true for. Onions lose their viability quickly. Leeks lose their viability quickly. Parsnips, those are probably the big three. But still, you're going to have better luck if you stuck them in the freezer, but they're not going to be something that's going to last for years and years. So certainly, and again, a lot of gardeners don't want to plant 20 of the same tomato. They may have 20 tomatoes, but they want some variety. And so you may only be having, 8 seeds out of a packet, and there may be 30 or 50 in there. And so that can last you for a few years. Yes.
I save my tomatoes and put them like from my tomatoes and put them on a paper towel and drying. And that worked great. I did the same with my chili peppers, and it didn't. It's like they didn't do it.
So
how do you save,
awesome.
dry seeds?
Great question. So she was saying that she had saved tomato seeds, and she did what I do, which is a very straightforward way of doing it. You just squirt the tomato seeds on a paper towel and let them dry. And when they're totally dry, you're done. What's great is you can write on the paper towel with a Sharpie. So the rule number 1 of seed saving is label, 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 label. Or you end up like me, you've got a paper towel with tomato seeds on it. You have no clue what they are. And then you have to plant them to find out. But she also tried the same thing with peppers, and it didn't work out as well. So one thing to understand about seed saving, I actually have a class on YouTube on this, but there's a difference between horticultural maturity or plant maturity and what I would say is culinary maturity. So a green pepper is not actually a mature pepper. A lot of peppers will color change when they reach true plant maturity. And so because of that, it's very likely you had an immature fruit from a botanical standpoint, even though it's perfect for the culinary side. And so you probably need to leave those fruits stay on there longer for the seed to mature. I can't guarantee you that. The other question is, well, was it a hybrid? Because one possible outcome of hybrid, saving seeds from hybrid, is they may not be viable. That's not always. Basically, you get a mix. It looks like mom. It looks like dad. It looks like what I grew. It looks like nothing I've ever seen before, or it's not viable. So it could have been any of those. But my guess would be they were immature.
The other thing is to just say, I found some seed packets, like the library has seed packets. Of course, some are not current, but it is fun to kind of, you're starting out.
Oh, yeah. And that's it. We haven't the past couple of years, but Johnson City Parks and Recreation actually did a seed swap for a few years there. And I think I'm going to see if they want to get it going again next year. But yeah, and we at the Lincoln Park Vegetable Garden, the first year we do that, the senior center actually had a bunch of seeds that had been donated by a retailer, and they were last year's seeds. They were fine. They hadn't been properly stored in the freezer. The first year they did fine. Second year, there were some that weren't fine, and we were supplementing with newly purchased seeds. But even when seeds aren't stored perfectly in a freezer, they're still good for more than one season, most of them. So yeah, don't discount your seeds that are left over. It's a great way to minimize your cost. It's also a great way to just, if you had something you liked, you've got more seed of it for the next year. Another question that sometimes, or things I run across on the internet, you'll see a lot of people saying, oh, don't buy your seeds at a dollar store, or, at the cheapest possible place. I wonder sometimes if those people are sponsored by seed companies or otherwise benefiting, because here's a few facts most people don't know about the seed industry. One, there's federal regulations on the seed industry about germination and purity and other requirements. So any seed that is sold in the U.S. has to meet minimum standards. Because I've seen people say, well, the seed you buy at the dollar store, it's not as good a seed as you buy somewhere else. What? It's, as I say, again, there's minimum requirements, and everybody meets the minimum requirements. The other thing is states, including Tennessee, all have their own requirements too, which fairly closely mirror the federal, but there are minimum germination standards. The seeds, they'll actually sample, and so the seeds actually have to be what they say they are. There has to be, the correct variety identified on the package. And so I don't see any reason why you shouldn't buy trees from the dollar store or wherever they happen to be the cheapest, because there's a lot of laws that tell you what you can and can't sell when it comes to seed. And so I do not personally believe that a tomato seed that happens to be purchased from a dollar store is any less of a quality product than one purchased anywhere else. Now, the caveat is what you will notice, the dollar stores have very limited variety. So it's generally not the latest and greatest varieties. Oftentimes they can be, not always, but they can often be older heirloom varieties, not necessarily F1 hybrids, but you can find hybrid seeds there as well. And lots of times there's a smaller quantity of seeds in there. So that's one reason they're cheaper. There's not as much in it. But again, if I don't need 45 red slicing tomatoes, I might be happy to have 15 in there and pay a smaller price. So again, none of the negatives, if you want to call them that, of variety availability or fewer seeds in the packet has any influence over whether they'll successfully grow a crop. They don't. So I would encourage you not to discount those and, make use of them, because there's no reason buying the same exact seed for more money somewhere else simply because it's a different store. If you're new to gardening, I want you to learn about crop rotation. And so plants are not just plants broadly. We have different plant families, and basically related plants share diseases and insect problems. So if we plant those in the same spot or in the same beds year after year after year, we can have more pest problems. It can also mean that we're exhausting certain nutrients if ones happen to be particularly heavy feeders of something, both not only on the nutrients they are utilizing, but even the rooting depth, because different crops have longer roots or greater root depth. And so rotating families is important. Here are the families, probably to make this brief and useful. Things like okra, sweet corn, and sweet potato, which basically are all by themselves in the vegetable garden, are great to have as rotating crops because they're not related to each other. So when we think of solanaceous or nightshade family, that is your tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, and potatoes. A lot of gardens see 2 to 3 of those at least, if not all 4. And so it's good sometimes to have things that are totally unrelated in the mix. Sweet corn, for instance, is actually a grass. So, I mean, it's totally unrelated in many, many ways to our other crops that we're growing as vegetables. But you can see some of the different ones there. And again, the ideal is a eggplant following tomatoes, for instance, is just as bad as planting tomatoes after tomatoes because they are related to each other. Practical application of this, if you sort of grow the same things most year, you sort of establish whether you have raised beds or not, you just kind of think of it as you have sections. And so one of them might be solanaceous, one of them might be corn, and basically every year that section gets moved one spot over. So that's all this is depicting, is you have year 1, and as you rotate through the years, you're just shifting those beds, whether it's literally a bed or not, so that you're moving it around. Truthfully, there's probably some utility in doing this in the home garden, because in the home garden, generally we're talking about a matter of short distance. I'm not going to yell at you if you don't do this, because realistically, flip-flopping ends of a garden is probably better than not doing anything, but I'm not going to act like that's like we're moving 3 miles away. A lot of these insects particularly can move. If we're using the same equipment in all the areas, some of the diseases can move on equipment, but still, it's not a bad habit to get into thinking about rotating through plant families whenever you can. If you're looking at limited gardening space or you don't want to take on too much, let me encourage you to look at dwarf or bush varieties or go vertical, because it's going to take less real estate to grow the same amount of produce. The one thing to understand about this, and like if you've ever heard of square foot gardening, they do a great job of many successions planted in the same area and dense plantings. But when we do things like that, we are worried about, do we have enough fertility in our soil? Because every time we make a harvest, we're removing nutrients. And also, is there enough water available at any given time? So the more densely we plant, the more frequently we're planting, the more we need to be careful about fertility and water both. And so lots of times people think about doing fertilizer at the beginning of the season. There are some crops that we come back and side dress. Tomatoes and peppers, for instance, we would side dress when the first fruits are starting to be about 1 inch in size. Things like broccoli and those, we would come back on those brassicas and side dress about 4 weeks after planting. So we're not always able to put all the nutrition now at the first start of the season. We do have to think about coming back, and certainly if we're going to be replanting areas with another succession of something, we may have to refertilize. Talking about growing vertically, there's any number of ways to do this. Collected some of these from online. On the left is a bamboo, and I believe that's beans or peas, probably beans. I'm not sure that trellis is going to stand up to the weight of beans. So do consider what you build if you're building a vertical structure for them to climb on. More traditionally, what we see with beans and poles like that is where you have 2 to 3, well, 3 normally or more as like a tripod arrangement, and beans planted at the base rather than having them growing across horizontal. So I feel by the time the season was over, that was on the ground, but at least they were trying to take advantage of vertical space. The middle picture reminds me to tell you I'm not responsible for anything that happens with the HOA. And no, Adam told me to do it is not a defense. But if you have an old canoe and bed spring laying around, you could use that in your vegetable garden. And certainly things like tomato cages can really help us keep plants more upright, under control. Doesn't mean that they're not worry-free or management-free, but it does really help us get more plants in the same amount of space. So I'd mentioned earlier, and so I thought it would be worthwhile here at the end to go over a little more specificity about some early season stuff. Generally, cool season crops are either going to be frost or freeze tolerant. So not everything can take a hard freeze like down to 25, 26. Some things can. Many of these will not grow well or at all during summer season. We kind of start very early, maybe mid-February for something like peas, for instance. And certainly the end of February, we can start looking at a lot of leafy greens and things of that nature. So early season are things like these crops you see here. You could maybe even say sweet corn, where we can plant middle-ish of April, could be called a cool season crop. One thing to understand is if we are sowing these out in the garden, the cooler the soil, the slower they are to germinate. So just expect that. They will be slow to germinate sometimes. And so it's not necessarily something to worry about if it's been a week and you don't see anything. Warm season vegetables, the short answer is everything is not cool season. So they are frost intolerant. It's going to cause damage or kill them outright. I also like to think of these as low soil temperature intolerant. They don't want to be cold at all. So certainly our main vegetables we think of: tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, squash, cucumbers, melons. Some of our cool season crops can tolerate to some extent the warmer temperatures. So especially very early warm season, we may be able to get some late plantings of some of those. Others, not at all. And then, of course, we have our fall season. Fall season, what's interesting about a fall garden, it's a mix. It is not just a mirror of the spring season, because we're actually starting on warm temperatures and moving to cool. So we can actually do warm and cool seasons both in the fall. But like our last planting of tomatoes, we may want in the ground by about July 15th. And we might be planting, some of our cool season crops as late as towards the end of August or so. And so we actually have a lot of diversity in a fall garden if we want it. It's not just broccoli and cabbage. We can actually do a lot in the fall garden. We sometimes start planting that in the summer to get the harvest in the fall. So What you see on your screen are the resources. I will be sending you an email that includes this. That's the direct link to that document. I will say, for those who have seen my other classes, I am shifting towards not having materials on Google Drive. So don't let it weird you out if you see that tiny URL directs you to a SharePoint site. That's correct. That's actually Microsoft Word and everything. Don't worry about it. It's just internally, University of Tennessee is shifting away from Google resources.